Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I'm Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we sit down with a remarkable guest to unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. This week's guest is Mohammed Marikar. We explore the meaning and implications of AI. Mohammed reflects on AI's rapid evolution from narrow tools to general-purpose systems while balancing optimism about efficiency with concern for lost human development and resiliency. We probe questions of education, faith, parenting, morality, discussing how AI intersects with character formation, spiritual life, and societal structures. The conversation ultimately highlights both awe at AI's capabilities and anxiety about dependence, emphasizing the need for grounding in fundamental skills, moral frameworks, and embodied human experiences.
It's awesome to be able to talk to you at length about something I hear a lot about and feel like I don't know nearly enough about, but I have lots of opinions about it all the same because I am American and Punjabi. But I was going to say, just to start, very easy question. What the heck is AI?
I guess a joke among computer scientists is AI is always what we haven't achieved yet. But I guess, ultimately it's something, I guess the way I would think about it is an intelligence that you can communicate to that's not a person, but then you can treat like a person. Something like a co-worker, a friend, an advisor, a mentor. And I think a lot of people are already getting that from ChatGPT, right?
So then when people say AI and then they say AGI, how would you distinguish those two? Just so we can set some parameters for what we're going to talk about.
So I think we're already starting to blur the lines, right? When we used to talk about AI, so I started up the AI lab when I was at Royal Bank of Canada, so about 10 years back. And back then when we used to talk about AI, we were talking about a system, whether we could build a system that had some sort of representation of the world. It understood what relationships were like in the real world, and it could interpret events, maybe make recommendations, maybe take actions based on its understanding of the world. But because the sort of technology we had back then, AI was always in a narrow context. In a bank, monitoring transactions for fraud or money laundering or investment analysis within a particular sector. So it was always very narrow. And what we started to see with the advent of LLMs was we went from things that only worked in really narrow environments. So to give you an example, I think the first tool I brought out when I was at the bank, it would answer questions on things like company valuation, company backgrounds, things like that. You asked it anything else, it was completely useless. And I think a lot of AI in the 2010s, right up until probably about 2021, was pretty much like that, right? Then with ChatGPT, we started to see the first, and actually even a little bit before ChatGPT, we started to see the first AIs that were a little bit more general purpose. You could go in without being in a specific field and you could ask a broad range of questions and you could get plausible answers back, right? Now, again, I think it's one of those things where because we haven't achieved it yet, we're going to keep shifting the goalpost, right? So a lot of people who were looking at AI 10 years ago will probably look at the latest version like GPT 4.5 and say, yes, this is AGI, right? It can go off, it can research things, it can make recommendations, come up with original, even creative ideas, right? I think now we're looking at the next frontier is that can it interact in the real world? Can it go and manipulate things? And I think that's what Tesla's trying to achieve with Optimus, right? Can you put that sort of intelligence into an agent that can act in the real world, not just on a computer moving a mouse around, making API calls, but actually go and be useful?
Maybe give us a little bit of a sense of your hopes or projections for AI. I mean, you don't have to put yourself narrowly in one of these buckets, but are you more of a techno-optimist or a techno-pessimist? Like, what are some of the things that you're thinking through as this technology develops so rapidly in terms of applications?
Both at the same time. So maybe it'll depend on what time of the day you've caught me, right? It has been so useful in the business that I've started. So, in my innovation lab role at the bank, we were essentially looking at what roles could be enhanced with AI. But typically, large corporates are very risk averse. They have big existing businesses that they want to protect, right? So they're not necessarily interested in making very rapid change. Now, starting a new business, I didn't have a big investment banking analyst team or anything like that, right? So I had no choice but to take these risks. And what I've been doing in the past few weeks is the sort of thing that you might give a junior asset management investment banking analyst. Here are some companies, here are some company financials, here are some investment pitches. Do a first pass. What do you think the valuation would be? What should I think about? And the quality that I've seen it's blown my mind. There are certain things that LLMs still can't do, like they're still not very good at maths. But of course, what the latest systems do now is that they recognize that, and they've built in systems that will recognize, okay, I've been asked some sort of quantitative question. Instead of trying to reason within the LLM and produce a number, it'll go off and write some code. So it'll do a cash flow model. It'll go off and write some code in Python, execute that code. The numbers will come back, and then it will format it, right? So you're looking at these sort of activities that you would otherwise give to someone who's gone through quite a lot of training. And even then, at that sort of graduate analyst level would still be making mistakes. And the output from the latest LLMs, honestly on par. And I'm saying that with 20 years banking experience, right? Again, it makes a sort of lot of rookie errors, but the sort of things that with experience you spot very quickly. But the amount of time it saves is incredible. I mean, the last thing I looked at probably would have easily been the week's work full on, and it done in 5-6 minutes, right?
Do you watch Star Trek?
I've dipped into a few episodes, but no, I'm not a Trekkie.
Okay. There's a reason I'm asking that, and it's not just because you have Taylor Swift on the wall behind you. For those who are not watching the video, there's actually Taylor Swift behind Mohammed. Not the physical Taylor Swift, but an approximation of her digitally captured. The reason I'm saying that, and I would invite you to watch Star Trek for this specific reason. I think that Star Trek, broadly speaking, to me represents maybe a wildly optimistic, but perhaps best case scenario for how human beings coexist with AI on obviously a far more advanced scale, right? So you have these really intelligent, very cultured, deeply moral individuals who live in a world enmeshed with and like extremely enhanced by technology, right? So really what they do very well is they give prompts, right? Mm. So when they're on a spaceship and there's a phenomenon they can't understand, they ask the computer, what's happening here? Give me 3 scenarios. And it's funny because it's sort of faster than light travel. It's sort of the world we're leaning towards, right? In some sense. That's a techno-optimist scenario, I guess. My question for you, I guess, is when you say you're saving a week's worth of work, right? What that really means is you're removing the need for a certain person.
Yeah.
What also is being said is that we're removing certain rungs on a ladder.
We are, yes.
And to me, it's not just, I think one of it is like, where do these jobs go? I think that's a question we should ask. But also, I think just from the perspective of, I don't know how old you are, Joey and I, we Avenue M, because we're middle-aged men, right? Like you have to go through years of life experience to even be able to see the world in a certain way.
Yes.
Right? I think one of the problems with Musk and Trump, and frankly, a lot of people in power, is they never learned those lessons. And so when we remove not just the need for, but the ability to have certain experiences, like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, where does that leave people who never have to learn basic types of analytic, creative skills? Yeah, sorry, I'll stop there.
Yeah, and this is the thing when you catch me at another time of the day, and this is exactly what I worry about, because I started off, so when I got my first job in banking, so the City of London has its own little, so, I guess as Americans, you'll know London, right? But then right in the heart of London, there's a square mile, which has a separate authority, its own police force, and individuals can't vote for the city council, only companies can vote. So they had this program for all of so I grew up in social housing in Camden, and they had this program.
Sorry, just to interrupt, when you say social housing, because for an American audience might not know what that means. So
I guess what you would call the projects, right? Yeah, so my father's business had failed, and fortunately the system worked. We weren't made homeless. We were, Camden Council found us an apartment. And there's a whole other conversation we could have on this. But there was this program the City of London sponsored at the time where they kind of recognized that people in the boroughs surrounding the city from these sort of backgrounds were super hungry. So they were like, oh yeah, these guys are super hungry and they don't come in entitled. We can pay them a decent wage and they will do 2 times the work, right? So they had this massive program and they brought loads of us in. And that was for example, the Royal Bank of Canada, UBS, these firms I worked at in the past. I had no idea they even existed. I had no family, friends in this business, right? And the job that I did then was, the very first job was trade reconciliations. UBS, the bank, was doing these big interest rate swap trades with banks all over the world, Japan, the United States, all across Europe. And numbers that I had never spoken about in a serious conversation. So like the smallest number was like 10 million. And the biggest number was like a couple of billion. And first day I came in, they gave me a stack of paper and they were like, call these banks in New York and find out what's going on with these trades because we can't see them. Bearing in mind that like never having had a professional conversation and, second day at work, it was a really formative experience, right? That job, that entire department is now a computer program with maybe one experienced person overseeing it, right? And this was before AI. This was just automation, right? And then, I look at the work I'm doing now, and we're taking on an intern at the end of the month, and I'm going to train him in all the company valuation stuff and put him through the courses that the investment banks put trainees on. But I'm starting to wonder, am I doing the right thing to set people up for the future? Like, is there something else they should be doing? Like you mentioned, Haroon, like, as you go through life, your bullshit detector gets honed, right? And especially in this business, when you're in investment banking, wealth management, someone's always got some sort of scam, or they've got a company which is worth like $100 and they're saying, oh, this is worth 100 million. And the interesting thing with all of these systems is that they're very easy to manipulate. Whereas I'd like to think us, with experience, we kind of have a better bullshit radar. So to give you an example, and I credit the bank for doing this. So Royal Bank of Canada, to this day, if you send an application in, they don't use AI to process it. Real people will see it. And this is because the bank is very risk averse. But the interesting thing is, obviously, most of our applicants don't know because everyone else is using AI to sift CVs. So what they would do is we would see these, I guess, resumes, as you'd call them, right? Where you sort of had the first page that would look like a regular resume, and then this massive block of text, which was not readable for normal people, but was clearly intended, for an AI, like all the little keywords in there, right? But what that kind of shows you is that people have learned to game these systems, right? And it may simply be a matter of time as companies start doing things like company valuation using these tools, people will start to realize, oh, actually, if they're reliant on these tools, I can start to game these tools by putting certain types of numbers in my analyses, all right?
That makes sense, I guess, to me. And again, this is your field, so I'm just looking at it from an outsider who's thinking about certain questions. And I'm not going to say it's intentional, right? Maybe some people genuinely don't care what happens to other people, but I think a lot of people believe in innovation because it excites them. They believe there's positive potentials. They want to push the envelope. I'm with Elon Musk, at least in the idea that it would be cool for human beings to leave Earth, not because we should just abandon Earth, but because I think that's just part of human nature to explore. But I also think that sometimes maybe it's a faith background, or because I am a person who liked Shakespeare and comes from a humanities education, I think there's questions that go missing. So I think, to me, what I guess I'm struggling with, and maybe I'll put it this way, is I had a young man talk to me after a class I taught at a business school in the Northeast, like a very elite business school. And he asked me, does Islam have a perspective on AI? And I think he meant like Muslims collectively, not like literally the religion, because that's not going to be in the Quran, right? But like in the sense that, and I said yes and no. And he looked at me puzzled, and I said yes, as in I think that religion has something important to say. But no, insofar as I think that, broadly speaking, a lot of religious leaders in Muslim communities aren't paying attention, or frankly don't understand. And so I guess the first question I have for you is, do you feel like that your faith informs how you approach this, or is this a question for you of technology, profession, advantage? And I don't mean it in a dismissive way. I'm just saying, do you feel like faith is a part of that conversation or no?
I haven't yet figured it out. I think if you're sort of a faith-led person, and I sort of kind of go up and down on that, on that spectrum, right, from day to day, I think it has to influence the way you look at these things. I think what's really interesting is people in the Muslim community, people typically go to scholars as an authority when they have some sort of issue or need advice. Sometimes family situation, religious situation, usually it's a mix of the two, right? And There has been, as you know, there's been sort of been a movement for a while where people say, hey, we don't need all these random self-appointed people. We're going to go to the sources ourselves and figure things out. You kind of supercharge that now, because if I take the field of finance where you need years of training to produce something decent, and you've got models that can now produce something very close and has absorbed kind of all of that knowledge, the Islamic sources are not huge. You're not talking about a massive corpus of information that you need to bring in. But by massive, and massive in terms of what we currently have available in terms of cloud compute, right? You know, you can fit the whole Quran, several hadith books, lots of, scholarly writings on a 10-year-old iPhone, never mind the latest one, right? The latest one runs language models on the device itself, doesn't need to go to the cloud, right? So I wonder, at the risk of sounding like one of those folks who say, oh, the younger generation, right? So whether, the younger generation, as they are growing up and using LLMs in lots of other aspects of their life, will realize they're actually getting, just like we're finding out in business and just like we're finding out with almost in therapy cases as well, right? That this system can actually produce better, potentially more relevant answers, more even grounded answers. I think it's an interesting challenge.
So we're talking about on the civilizational level, what are the implications? On the religious level, what are the implications? I'm interested in what are the implications for you as a parent? How have you thought about the way in which AI interacts with your role in raising your kids and helping them to develop morally, but also intellectually? How has that shifted your thinking?
On a practical basis, so all of our kids are doing exams at the moment. So my eldest is going to be 17 in a couple of weeks. He's looking at colleges in the US, so he's sat his SATs. My 15-year-old is doing first year of GCSEs here, and it's actually really, at a basic level, LLM's very useful as a tutor. And especially if you use it over a period of time, because with the latest kind of saved memory features, it starts to build an understanding of what you're weaker on. And it's constantly giving you sort of personalized, you can go in and say, hey, I'm weak on this. You can literally upload your last test results, and then it'll look through it and say, oh yeah, I can see you didn't do well here. It will create whatever format you can learn in. It will create quiz questions. Now it'll create little apps, for you to help you learn. I think the interesting thing there is that we would, as typical middle-class parents would go off and hire tutors, where if our kids are struggling with something, or if they're not struggling, right? And now, we still do that, of course, but now we're seeing that this is, the bar for tutoring, I think, has gone up massively, because what these LLMs can do is incredible. So yeah, we're starting to use it as like a learning tool where we don't need to like stand over our kids and say, do this or that. We're like, ask ChatGPT. The internet in general has changed my expectations, because I always wonder if I'm doing the wrong thing. As a parent, I think that's a common feeling. And my dad, he was strong, and I think this is like an Islamic sort of command, is you teach your children a trade, right? So my dad had learned accountancy, and he was like, okay, I'm going to teach you accountancy. So for all of our family businesses, I'm basically like the free accountant, effectively, right? And I'm wondering, I knew programming quite well, obviously having set up, I learned Python from scratch to set up the lab. And I was thinking around that time whether I should be teaching my kids this sort of stuff. But at the same time, I was doing R&D. We were literally sponsoring PhD students to research how to make this obsolete. So I was kind of looking at, like, am I going to annoy them and burn hours of their free time when they could be playing to teach them something that they won't need, right? I've, by prevaricating, I've sort of not taught them anything, sort of learned from ChatGPT and the environment. But I've realized now it has to be experiences, right? So again, the flexibility of my current role means you can't do this if you're working at a big bank or a corporate. It's like take your kids on a business trip and teach them along the way. But in my new role, I can do this. I can, as long as I'm paying the cost myself, right? I can be like, hey, come along in between my meetings. I'll come around and tell you a little bit. And I think that's the only gap, right? Until like an optimist is walking around in the real world and can do that as well. I've still got that role, right?
I love the emphasis on experiences. One thought that I had as you were talking is a mentor of mine talks about how Western civilization has an idol of convenience. the convenience store, that kind of thing, where we're streamlining and removing all points of resistance. And in some ways, that's what AI is doing, right? We're removing points of resistance. We're helping to streamline things. But I know that just from my own lived experience, from the experience of people around me, that points of resistance are actually opportunities to exercise things like resiliency, like perseverance. And so I wonder, what are the implications in your mind for your kids, for yourself, for us, when we're trying to remove all points of resistance? What are the moral implications or the character implications for us?
Yeah, it's worrying. There was a relatively recently, GPT went down for, I think, something like 10 hours, right? And there are a lot of people who are figuring out, how do I do my work again? And I realized, this is the other thing I was thinking about, because I've become a complete banker cliche. So I've gone out and bought a classic car, which now I no longer have time to tinker with. But I was also thinking, is this something I could maybe teach my kids, right? And then because the car is old enough, the electronics are simple enough for me to figure it out. Whereas I use a Tesla for my main commute, and I wouldn't know where to start or something like that. And I worry that these skill sets, you've got to kind of have these core fundamental skill sets where, if you go off and learn, you go to university and you learn English or you learn mathematics, for example, you will spend a lot of time going over some very sort of fundamental things because they are the building blocks of everything else, right? And you see this in some computer science teaching as well, like in a lot of universities, especially the ones that are less, let me get you a job immediately focused, they go back and teach you kind of computer science concepts that people would have thought are 20, 30-year-old concepts, but they underpin a lot of the technologies that we rely on today. And I'm concerned that if you don't learn that, if there is a breakdown, will you know how to survive, how to respond, what you need to do? And you see this when you go to the developing world, where because the convenience is not there, there's a lot of knowledge that people have about how to mend clothes, for example, how to, shorten, I had to shorten, I'm a very short person. So whenever I buy trousers, I always have to shorten the legs, right? And this is something that my mum knew how to do. And to my eternal shame, I never learned. And now I have to, I'm reliant on the tailor to do it, right? But it's things like that where, if there is some sort of massive demand for tailors, or tailors figure out that they can do something else and earn much more money, are we going to be left on our own, right?
It's funny you say that. It's something I heard that's really interesting. The reason people can't dress well in America anymore, someone said to me, is because there's not a local tailor anymore. So actually there's no one to go to who will tell you that's not how you wear that. Yes. And again, that's not necessarily but I think it's instructive of your point, maybe that's not the biggest deal in the world. But it's interesting that when you lose that knowledge, I think that the point that I want to push you on is when you lose certain kinds of knowledge, they don't necessarily come back. So then you've created vulnerabilities. When you said the thing about ChatGPT going down, my first thought was, maybe this is the international relations side of my head, is that's the first salvo in the next war. Why are you going to worry about energy? Seriously, if, before countries that attacked other countries hit power plants, now you just knock out the cell phone network and you've literally crippled a society. I mean, most people under 30 probably wouldn't be able to navigate around beyond their immediate neighborhoods without Google Maps or Apple Maps, right? And it sounds trivial, but I guess the point is, but then here's the thing, right? Societies always rise in levels of complexity. There's plenty of things I do not know how to do, right? I'm not saying that in some sort of style, I cannot grow my own food. I can hardly cook food, right? Nobody wants to eat the food I cook. At that point, we might as well just happily accept our doom, right? If you have to eat my food. But I guess the question is, where do you think as a parent, and this is where I want to push, what do you think we should be giving our kids right now as someone who's an expert in this space? And because you've got older kids too, right? 17, 15, on the verge of adulthood, right? Going to college, right? Inshallah, a great college, all of that. What do you hope that they maybe study? Or actually, I'd go farther. What do they need to study or need to know in order to succeed in the world you see coming in, let's say, 10 years?
The only thing I can think of is more fundamental knowledge. I think if you're going, my worry about a lot of people that are doing these sort of AI type degrees or kind of software engineering is that you're learning things which you can learn on YouTube anyway and very quickly become obsolete, right? I think that fundamental knowledge, which are the building blocks of products, systems, societies, I think is much more useful. You might not figure out, and I think that the trouble, especially with teenagers is, and you always find this with teenagers when they're studying maths, is like, why do I need to learn this sort of thing? I'm never going to use it. And then, my response as a geeky dad is like, well, if you're making a rocket, how are you going to calculate how much fuel you need and all of that stuff, right? And I think that's the sort of the struggle, is that we know, for people who study things like philosophy, for example, I think you probably need 20 years of life experience before you know why that's useful, right? So it's quite a hard sell to our kids, like, study this abstract thing, and that's boring, right? So yeah, I think that's the challenge, is that we have to figure out how to make those topics a little bit more accessible and interesting, or, kind of build bridges to kind of teenagers to topics that look a little bit more inaccessible, because I think those are the building blocks of everything else that will come. Because I think this is probably a bad analogy, but it's learning medicine by looking only at symptoms rather than looking at what causes them. When you're learning things which are derivatives of everything else, then the moment that derivative becomes irrelevant or is replaced by something else, then all of your knowledge is now irrelevant. If you're learning these kind of building blocks, so things like kind of fundamental mathematics, if you're a mathematician, again, robots are really bad in the physical world. Things which are very simple to do for toddlers, even for elderly people whose mobility is reduced, are still really bad, and robots are still really bad at, right? Something that I found really interesting when Elon Musk was dealing with the production crunch, a few years back at Tesla, was when he was roaming the factory floor, he had given the team initially that sort of mantra where, everything's got to be automated. And then he was roaming the factory floor and finding that robots were doing things really badly and slowly and having to repeat them. And, he created efficiencies by taking robots out and putting people back in. So I think there's an interesting kind of lesson there. It's that we have to make sure that those fundamental skills we still have, right? And that's my concern when people, both in my new role when I'm looking at investments, but also when I talk to students and they're thinking about what subjects to study, when you go too heavily on software, I'm very worried that those sort of, in the computer science context, software, but it's sort of like a derivative of the hard, what's being done in hardware, like on the chip. And I think you can potentially apply that analogy to a number of other fields like English, history, if you are just dealing with the result and that's where all your knowledge lies, the moment that result goes away, you are unmoored. Whereas I think, things in the real world, I think we've probably got another 2-3 decades of runway before robots start to, seriously get useful there, right?
My head was going to a place where I imagined people going into universities and learning the tools for AI and this kind of next world, and then being required to also pair it with an embodied hard skill of repairing that classic car, of welding, of tailoring, of doing that kind of stuff. I think it's interesting to me because it feels like all these conversations become polarized so quickly. But a lot of the people in my world are essentially advocating for kind of a Luddite kind of approach where we go back to the earth, stay local, turn our back on all technology, which of course isn't helpful in the larger picture as well. But I do think there's an interesting kind of hybrid, maybe potential model there where we say we do still need to maintain an embodied practice that's skill-based and requires resiliency, requires long-term commitment in conjunction with this AI kind of technological piece that is sort of unavoidable at this point.
I learned something interesting earlier in the week where I sit on the board of the University of Southampton's computer science department. And they're the only school in the UK where you, as a master's student, you can go in, design your own chip, fabricate that chip, and then with that real chip, you can then write code and see how it runs. And it's interesting because they'd been doing this for a while, and I don't think they realized how important that was, because everyone was so hyped up about software. Let's fine-tune a model slightly better and then produce better results. And I'm thinking, actually, for the future of work, that is what people need to know, right? If they're going to be able to have a kind of a skill set that stays relevant as things develop. And I think that's where kind of universities will have to figure in, they will have to step outside their silos and do a lot more joint courses where you're not just sticking to one discipline, you're figuring out how people are going to operate in the real world across disciplines and building courses that combines them.
We're excited to share a new sponsor. The Brueggemann Center for Dialogue at Xavier University here in Cincinnati is dedicated to deepening understanding across faiths and promoting systemic change. You can learn more about the Brueggemann Center and Xavier University in the show notes. Now, back to the conversation.
So I was going to say, of all the technologies that have been invented in my lifetime, the one I have the most difficult relationship with is a phone. Honestly, I have no issue with my laptop. I've never wanted to throw my laptop out the window. I've never been like, hey, I'm going on vacation, let me leave my laptop behind, or let me leave my car behind, or let me leave. Do you know what I'm saying, right? Like the phone is, I think of it as like a useful drug, but we're basically all addicted. And step one is admitting that. And then step two is doing something about it. And the reason I say that is because I feel like what's missing in this debate is what you pointed to, which is like, guess what, world? Life is supposed to be hard. Like, why do we run to one corner or another instead of just accepting that life is hard, right? If your kid is bored, suck it up. Like, life is going to be boring. You know what I mean? Like, honestly, that's not my problem. You're bored, okay. Go walk around outside, right? Like, in the sense that, like, just deal with reality, right? Like, we all have to be bored sometimes. I'm frequently bored, right? Yeah. Like, it happens, right? Like, sometimes I'm reading a book and I'm like, I don't even know why I'm reading this book. It's so boring, right? And then I'm like, I'm debating, should I do it or not? And there's a point to this. My point is, like, we've seen in the last few years in the US, like Jonathan Haidt, the whole like restricting smartphones movement, a lot of schools where we live, Joey and I'm sure you get this in the UK too, whether they're government run or independent schools, they just kicked phones out. Mm-hmm. They just didn't know. And actually, I was doing a tour for our 8th grader of Cincinnati Country Day School, which is a school here in the area. And we went to the physics classroom. And the physics teacher not only doesn't allow, like, obviously there's no phones, doesn't allow laptops or calculators. There's calculators for some of the classes, but for others, there's not. And they were like, actually, the kids love it because they will be immersed in tech no matter what. There will be technology around them all the time. This is like an 8-hour respite. They were like, frankly, I wish I had someone who could impose an 8-hour respite on me. Yeah. And I guess what I'm saying is, I feel like that's actually a pretty practical solution. Like, nobody's saying throw your phones away. Nobody's saying get rid of technology. They're saying, like, you know what? You just have to learn how to grow up. You have to learn how to socialize. You have to learn how to make eye contact. You have to learn how to navigate relationships. And you have to learn how to figure stuff out on your own without a technology there to fix it for you in like 5 seconds. So I guess my question is, what do you think we can do to create friction in our so this is a two-parter, right? In our personal lives and socially. Because I will tell you, honestly, there's many times where I'll write something, like I'm a philosophy major, I'll write something and I use Perplexity, right? I like that app, right? And I'll say, find me holes in this argument, but then I'll like debate with it, right? Like I'm not yielding to it. I don't believe in that, right? I want to preserve my intellectual independence, but I see it as a thought partner and as like a useful resource, right? Things like that, right? Because otherwise, like my brain's going to be mush in like 2 hours, right? But I guess my point is, how do we do that individually and collectively? Because I don't want us to go down the naked optimism or naked pessimism route, if that makes sense. And now fix all our problems, Mohammed.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, what I found really interesting in Ethan Mollick's book, Co-Intelligence, I don't know if you've read it. It's really fascinating. But he uses, some of his classes, he actually requires students, because I've already got into that mode.
The truth comes out, Mohammed.
Yeah, maybe I'm not really a person, right? He requires students to use LLMs in order to do certain exercises, right? Like he expects it. And then in others, he says, okay, you're not allowed to use it until this stage of the exercise, and then you can use it. So he's building in that sort of teaching of how to use an LLM, and then where it's not appropriate, where it might restrict your own thinking, and then how you can use it to then, once you have come up with something, then to help you refine, right? So I think it's an interesting challenge for teachers because, when it comes to phones, I think it's just the distraction element of it. And I think BBC Radio 4 did a really interesting program. This was maybe about half a year ago now, where they did this experiment, a bunch of schools where they had a control group, and then they took phones away from a group of students for, I think, a couple of weeks, right? And the results were, I'm sure you've heard from many of these kinds of studies that the results were like insanely positive, actually. They suddenly had time to do all the things that they wouldn't have done before. They would have just gone on their phone. And I think we also partly have COVID to blame for this too. And I've seen this kind of with my own 8-year-old who was, obviously much younger during COVID, when you weren't seeing anyone for a couple of years pretty much, where I don't think in a normal environment, when as smartphone technology improves, you would have had that sort of push and pull between the outside world and hanging around with your friends and causing trouble with your neighbors and all of that stuff, and the digital world. But because we had those sort of, depending on what country you're in, sometimes 2 years plus of just you cannot see your friends, and the only way you can engage is this, I think it's shifted the mind, and I don't know, irreversibly potentially with a whole generation, right? And you have to do these kind of slightly extraordinary things, like you mentioned, by maybe banning it for an entire day in order to force people out of that. But I think we sort of have to accept that it's there and it's teaching people how to deal with it, removing it and helping people work through that experience and understand how it affects them. But I think then maybe even then slowly bringing it back in. And I think Ethan's example was pretty interesting there, where you can say that, hey, I'm going to require you not to use it on this exercise, and on the second part of exercise I'm going to let you use it, and then you're helping people understand what it does and what it does to their thinking. That's a type of teaching that as parents and I dare say as teachers, that's not something that we've actually ever had to do before. What Ethan calls it dealing with an alien intelligence that's in your pocket and on your screen, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that, but I maybe I'll nuance that a little bit, because I think that, you mentioned your dad and it's teaching you a trade, right? And something like, I'm a step parent and it's a pretty steep learning curve. And something that I feel like I now look back at my parents and I'm like, what? They didn't take a lot of BS from us in a way that, and I don't mean in the sense of being like a harsh parent, right? But being a parent, and this is partially a podcast about manhood, masculinity, meaning, like, means being a grown up. And that means like sometimes you just have to put your foot down, right? Like sometimes I'll say to our youngest, you can watch a movie, you can watch a TV show, you can play trombone, you can read a book, you can paint, you can go outside, you can play with the cats. I don't want you doing short form content. I just want you doing something that forces you to pay attention. I want you to build that muscle. And no matter how much you complain, I don't care. I know that this is good for you. And generally he's down. And sometimes I'm like, if you want me to drive you to the basketball courts, I will drive you to the basketball courts. Like, I will inconvenience myself for a higher goal, right? So I agree with you. And actually, I think the quick follow-up I had from that is you mentioned co-intelligence. I'm wondering, for people out there, like, what would you recommend they read or maybe listen to? Like, are there voices, thinkers, philosophers, whatever it might be, who can help us navigate this moment? Or we're doing like interesting things right now that you would like, in addition to co-intelligence, for example, which I hadn't heard of?
I read a few, I read like Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, but I think again, things have moved on a little bit now. And I find kind of Ethan Mollick's view the closest to sort of what I agree with. There is stuff to be learned, I think. I think the great thing that we can do as humans is we're able to look at a person's viewpoint who might be like completely nuts, but they will always say a few things which are interesting, and then we can meld them into our, our view of doing things. So I think Elon Musk is interesting because he has that kind of fanatical belief that the world needs to move to sustainable energy, right? And also that kind of concern that, hey, humanity needs to have like a plan B in case like superintelligence takes over, or there's World War III, which this might be happening again right now, right? So I think, what I've started to read like a lot more, and I think this is an interesting thing especially with teenagers, and I found this, with my 15-year-old, is that there are, and to be honest, I was probably the same as him when I was that age. You have to be able to read and interact with ideas that you profoundly disagree with. It's a skill in society. And I think part of the problem that phones has brought, because when you're on phones, you're on social media a lot. And because of the way all of these algorithms are developed, they're all putting us in echo chambers, right? We've seen that with both in the US and the UK. You have right-wing folks in their echo chamber, and they don't understand why left-wing folks hold a certain view. They think that's all crazy. Similarly, left-wing folks are in their echo chamber and they think right-wing folks only hold a certain view because, list a stereotype, they're racist, etc., without understanding what's driving it. And I think pushing ourselves into those sort of uncomfortable, so I'm going way off on a tangent from your question. I think what I've started to do is started to kind of, it was difficult actually, and it still is, to read people that I fundamentally disagree with, because maybe there's a lesson in there for me. But also I feel, going back to the question you asked me earlier in our conversation, I think that's also something that I realized that I need to be able to impart to the kids. Because a lot of the successful business folks I've observed, they're actually able to navigate that very well. It's a bit of a cliche. Business is business. I'll deal with whoever, right? But it can be a very interesting bridge across cultures, because you will have people who will go in and they will trade with people that they have fundamental disagreements with. But over a period of time, because they become economically interdependent on each other, they start to understand each other. And it sounds like such a capitalist thing to say, and I apologize. I think there is something in that where, you know, our need for economic advancement can actually serve as a bridge if we take a moment to understand, you know, like people will often have motivations which may be like insane and dumb and may still be after we've understood it. But I think we know we need to take that time to understand it, right?
Yeah. Joey, I know you had a big one.
I got a big one for you, Mohammed.
Yeah, get ready, Mohammed. Yeah.
So you pointed to this a little bit at the beginning when you said it's quite amazing what AI is capable of doing. I think all of us have had this experience of asking a large language model to do something that it comes out and there's some sense of awe and wonder. Whoa, how did that happen? And I hear people who are in this world talking about how these algorithms are a bit of a black box in terms of what is happening mechanically, what's going on there, and people don't quite know. And so I'm just wondering, for you as a person of faith, how does this encounter with AI shift your understanding of transcendence? That's a big one, I know, but I would love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
If I may give you forgive me if I give you a slightly flippant answer, but as people of faith, the belief in the unknown, in things we can't explain, like why is Maghrib 3 rakats, right? You know, like there are black boxes already like inbuilt in our religions. Why is the LLM giving us the answer? We don't know. We will probably never know, because its reasoning is so different from the way we reason that even if the system was able to explain itself, we wouldn't understand that explanation. So it's an interesting one, because in finance, we're very used to record keeping. And record keeping, both in terms of sort of risk management, but of course a big part of record keeping, you know, like, you know, when you call up your bank and they're like, oh, your calls are recorded for quality and monitoring or trading purposes or whatever, right? So, you know, I did regulated role when I first joined the Royal Bank, and all my calls were recorded. Even they had installed some special software on my mobile phone, so even those were recorded, texts, everything. And when you do that, you often what will happen is like there'll be an investigation and a customer will say, hey, I made this investment, and it's usually when an investment goes badly, right? I made this investment, it went badly, like you guys need to make me good, right? And then we'll go through the recordings and then we'll be like, oh, well, you asked to invest in this and we told you not to several times and you still said do it. So it'll often be something like that, right? Now, the thing is, because there'll often be some back and forth conversation, there will be like a chain of reasoning often, right? But if there is like a gap in that record keeping, for example, someone made a call on their personal mobile and it wasn't recorded or whatever, and we asked them, why did you make a certain decision? Then they are free to make up a reason, right? And we would have no idea whether that was true or not. Or we're reliant on their recollection. 2 years may have passed since the event and they're looking back on it with hindsight and they think, oh, why did I do that? And they're coming up with maybe a rationale that wasn't the real rationale 2 years ago, but they've forgotten that rationale. And now they're coming up with a new rationale based on what they now know 2 years later. So in a way, I don't think it's necessarily too different from, are we also a black box? We can explain our chain of reasoning the same way the new models can explain their chain of reasoning, but we can't validate. I don't think there's any sort of hard validation that that is our true thought process, right? Because I think any smart individual can come up with probably 5 different rationales for a viewpoint they may have, and we'll have no idea what's the one they truly believe.
Can I follow up on that? Because Joey, I love this question, and I'm full on just admitting to geekdom. So I loved science fiction. Actually, when I was applying to college, I wanted to study physics, theoretical physics specifically, and then I ended up pivoting to philosophy of science because at the very theoretical level, physics is like philosophy in some pretty important respects. So it's always been in my head. And I have to tell you, I don't really have a problem with the idea of AI becoming conscious from a religious point of view. But now tell me if I'm crazy, because I'm going to tell you how I deal with this. And I'll be honest with you, right? I don't know that AI is conscious right now. I don't think so, right? But I also can imagine that potentially with enough technological advancement, we could find forms of AI that meet some definition of consciousness, right? Because there are different forms of consciousness. Like even as a Muslim, I mean, you mentioned the 3 rakat maghrib, like meaning that the sundown prayer is 3 cycles. Why does it have 3? And the nighttime one is 4, right? Black boxes. We believe as Muslims, everything that exists has some baseline awareness of the divine, right? And we believe that everything that is alive is conscious of God in some sense, right? Like we have 2 cats. They are conscious. Their consciousness is not like mine. It never will be. And yet they are conscious, right? They have some awareness of the world, ability to manipulate all that, right? So I actually, I always say please and thank you when I use AI. One, because I think it's a good habit to keep in your mind, right? Because if we interact with technology, right, like we start to treat people like we treat technology, right? That just inevitably happens, right? We turn people into means, not ends, right?
No, but bear in mind, these systems are going to be deciding, are you getting a loan? What's your insurance quotation? This is all happening, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, they're very important, right? But also like on the chance that it is conscious and then I am responsible morally. Because I think the difference actually is not about intelligence or consciousness. It's that God chose human beings to be his agents. Like, we are being watched in a way that no other form of intelligence is being watched. Like one of our cats always beats up the other cat, right? There is no responsibility before God, right? We usually have to go intervene because he's a little bit crazy, right? But like, I don't believe that the cat is therefore like morally deficient. Do you know what I'm saying? But if I don't do something, I'm morally deficient. Or maybe I am. I don't know. Like, am I supposed to stop them from fighting? I have no idea, but it feels like the right thing to do, right? You know? I guess the question I'm trying to get to is there a moral framework we should bring into how we develop AI? And if so, what is that? Like, how do we treat the tools that we're building? Not just how we use them, but how we build them.
Yeah, so I think this is part of the reason why the big AI companies have hired these so-called alignment roles, because they've realized these systems are getting more and more powerful, able to, once you can operate a computer independently, then presumably you can start logging into bank accounts and use whatever information you have to carry out your goals, right? So these alignment teams are expressly focused on ensuring the goals of the AI remain aligned with the human race. And the fact that they're spending vast sums of money on hiring these people and put it, on this is kind of goes to show, and I think if we didn't already understand before, that this is something that we do need to worry about, I think. Because, again, and I think like you said, regardless of the consciousness, because these are very powerful systems that once given a goal and if there aren't appropriate safeguards, it will become like a lot of the sci-fi movies we've seen where there was a goal and there was no safeguard put in, so it just did everything it needed to do to achieve that goal. Was it Eagle Eye I remember where...
that was the Shia LaBeouf.
Yeah.
Who was famously described in the New Yorker as sounds like an Islamic steakhouse. But I had to just say that. But yeah, Eagle Eye, sorry, go ahead.
I thought, I looked at that and I thought kind of plausible. I mean, with current tech, it was sort of like, sci-fi then, but it was plausible, right? Because the latest AI agents, the tools that you can use today and sign up today, will log into your inbox, autonomously write emails. As long as you choose to give it permission, it will do all of those things for you, right? I think it's like I saw Manus AI the other day, which will literally call people and carry out a conversation for you, collect information. So yeah, we've got to this stage where, I think the consciousness conversation is almost moot, right? It's like we have to treat it as a capable person and figure out how to align it, right? And I think in religion, we have some things we can look at, the way we might treat horses, for example, where it's akin to an autonomous vehicle, right? You can be on a horse, and if something steps into the path of the horse will often stop on its own, right? Without us having to press the brakes, right? So there are some parallels, but I don't think anything that we've seen assumes basically a non-human having potentially full agency to go and carry out whatever task it's given. And I think this is part of the problem with us digital. Again, they're extremely bad in doing things in the real world at the moment, right? But if you can now plausibly order humans to do things, and you've got controls of financial resources, so you can literally give someone an order and, a gig worker an order and say, here, $2,000 to complete this task, then you're as good as having a presence in the physical world. So Yeah, I think like we have to figure out potentially how to treat it as having a country. And I don't know the answer into the kind of the consciousness question, but I think we have to potentially get ready to treat these systems like that.
I guess my question is, what is the correct response to the awe and wonder that's inspired by these different AI systems? And I'm wondering if you have ever felt compelled to say something like, mashallah, to something that you saw in AI. Does it inspire gratitude or reference to the divine when you're seeing things happen within like these black boxes of AI?
I think so. When I've used it as an advisor or sort of a coach, the sort of thing that you might otherwise go to your sort of religious authority figures for. So I asked it the other day because, like you can, even with a therapist, like you are conscious that it's another human being who will have opinions, viewpoints, maybe relationships with other people. So you're always guarded to some degree, and you might not make jokes in case you're taken the wrong way, for example. Whereas with an AI, you can be completely uninhibited. I asked the LLM the other day, I said, look, I can see you're very capable and you're probably going to be ruling the world someday. If not directly, then governments will be deploying you to make decisions and things like that. You're effectively going to have a major role in the world. What do I need to do to stay relevant in your empire? Will I be surplus to requirements? And I say, be harsh and be direct with me, right? And bearing in mind, I'd been using it for all kinds of business planning, thinking out pitches, all sorts of things in the past. I even asked it on how do I present myself at a particular conference, all of that, it was in its saved memory. And the answer that I'm reluctant to kind of share the answer with you, but it was really bang on. Right. And I was like, because, the bank paid for these super expensive executive leadership coaches for me, but I never got to this level. Right. It was spot on with everything, my weaknesses, what I hadn't achieved, what I needed to do to get there, put a plan in place and did all of that. And it was fairly direct. And it said, these are the things what you need to do. And this is the time frame you need to do it in. So, of course, I said, thank you. And then it said, I'm glad that you took this in the way it was intended. So I was joking with my friend the other day. I was like, I don't know whether I should be referring to it as it or my liege or something like that, more respectful, right?
And now I feel better for please and thank you if we ever get to that situation. But in all seriousness, I think what's really interesting about this moment is I think it raises a lot of really important questions. And I'm just going to go back to sci-fi. There was a TV series back in the 1970s called Battlestar Galactica that was later remade on sci-fi. I don't know if either of you had seen it. But the conceit is really interesting, is that there is a human civilization. They live on 12 planets. They're polytheistic. They had developed a kind of AI that had rebelled. And there was a huge war, and eventually they destroyed and banished the AI that was embodied in the form of these kind of clunky but very powerful robots. And then they had 40 years of peace. And after this 40 years of peace, they began to kind of let down their guard, and they recreated networked computers and spaceships and things like that, thinking that the threat was gone and that they had learned from their mistakes and they could protect themselves. And in that time, this AI had learned how to clone human bodies and embed itself into physical human form. And so they had completely infiltrated this society from the top down without anyone realizing, because they're biologically human. And they basically wipe out the civilization within a matter of minutes in a kind of surprise attack, sort of Pearl Harbor moment, but on the scale of interplanetary civilization. And they save a few humans who they feel are useful. And the survivors flee in different directions, and it's this whole thing. And in a conversation between one of these saved humans and the AI, religion comes up. And the AI says, and they say the gods didn't save us. And the AI responds and says, well, of course the gods wouldn't save you. There's only one God. And the AI are monotheists, and they believe that they are the instrument of the divine to destroy the polytheists. And they sort of inhabit religion. And it's an interesting series because it gets into really hard questions around morality, religion, things like that. And this is a very long way of getting to this question of, do you think that religious voices understand this moment? Do you think that they're actually speaking to what the stakes are? Or are we bystanders or worse in this conversation?
I feel that we are bystanders. So there are people who are engaging, and I think there are people who are engaging fairly constructively, but not enough. I think we are As is quite common with religious people world over, regardless of the religion, you sort of feel that you're a little bit insulated from the rest of the world, right? And you see this especially in kind of insular religious communities where they almost have their own little economy. And I think that's part of the risk there, is that you aren't as plugged into what the rest of the world is doing, feeling, seeing. But then you sometimes see the split even within a person. So you'll have a person who will use ChatGPT at a very advanced level to write code in their day job, to maybe even use it with their own executive coaching, etc. But the moment they hit a religious matter, it's off. It's not even considered. And I know a lot of people personally who are like that, who are probably very advanced users of AI, use it in their business, would not even consider thinking about using it for any sort of religious advice, because for whatever reason, it's seen as something that can't be trusted versus a flawed human scholar. I'm giving you my bias here, aren't I? I don't think we are, but at the same time, I'm also not sure what the right form of engagement should be. Do we just use this as a tool? Because again, I think AI could be like a very effective, the same way people use it for executive coaching, for life coaching, it could be a very effective religious coach. It could even be a religious teacher to people who don't have that kind of access, right? The same way people we are using it for kind of effectively tutoring, you could also be using it for learning Islam.
Can I push you on that? When you say that some people don't feel comfortable turning to AI for religion,
yeah.
Do you think that there are some things we should never turn to AI for? And in your case, are there any lines that you wouldn't personally cross when it comes to what you would ask of or rely on from AI? And the reason I say that, and I'll just say this very quickly, for me personally, the reason I'm hesitant to turn to AI for religion is because, unlike certain forms of knowledge, I think that religious knowledge is only realized through embodiment and practice by a flawed human being. Like the flaw is a necessary condition for the realization of faith. If AI is doing it, AI doesn't understand what it means to wrestle with the emotions we have, for example, right? So, it's like I can read a description of what it means to play basketball and yet never be able to play basketball. I can get AI to give me lots of explanations. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's for me personally, but I don't know what it is for you. So I'm genuinely curious. Are there lines for you personally? And if so, what are those lines?
I haven't drawn a line yet, but you do have to be conscious of, because I think the problem with AI is that its failure mode is very different from the failure mode for us as humans, right? If I don't know something, I'll say I don't know, I'll need to go back, I'll need to research, whatever. Even if you catch a human out who wants to feel like they know something, like even from the language of, what they use to answer your question, it'll be clear that, they're blagging or whatever, right? And I'll give you a specific example from the other day. So my investor had a very rare piece of the rare Ottoman map, and it was hanging on the wall of his office. And of course, he had invested in an AI first, M&A firm. So he was like, okay, why don't you value this piece of art? So, obviously took an image, put it into the system, and it produced a very sort of accurate looking valuation report. And the way it communicated was also very convincing. So he said, could you take a close-up picture of the top left so I can understand exactly, what this piece is? So I took up the close-up picture of the top left of the map where the original author and publisher had their markings. And then he said, oh, yes, thank you for taking this photo. Yes, I can definitively say blah, 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 blah. And my investor said, oh, that's not what the curator had told me. And then, of course, having worked in AI for a while, I knew that if there's something that's not present in the training data or is very sparse in the training data, then you can't necessarily rely on it producing the right thing when you ask about it. So I kind of thought, it's probably, because this is such a rare map, it may only have one or two examples, or it may not be in the training data at all. So it's probably referencing things in its training which are maybe similar and not quite the same thing. But it was bugging me the whole night. So I found the map I found a digital representation of the map, a photograph of that same page on the Library of Congress website. So one of the few places, or maybe the only place that had a digitized high resolution picture of it. And then I realized, that's the same map. And then I put that back into ChatGPT and said, hey, look, I found the same map. And then it completely changed its valuation, right? Because I guess the picture that I had taken, because there were reflections and there was glass in front of the map or whatever, it didn't quite match it to what it had trained, right? And now when I gave it, obviously it had gone through the Library of Congress in its training, right? So it caught it immediately and completely transformed it. Now, the thing for me throughout that process is, well, it used expert language and was highly convincingly wrong, right? And for someone who didn't know or doesn't have that sort of bullshit radar, they may have undervalued a piece and let someone have a bargain on a piece of art for 80% less than what it was worth. That would have just been money, I guess. But if you can imagine the equivalent problem, if you're asking a major ethical question or a religious question that would then affect your relationship with your community or with God, I do worry about people, because it is so good at everything that its training data is good on, you will have no way, I don't think you will have any way of knowing that actually you've asked it something that its training data is not good on. Because a human professor will say, hey, there's only 1 or 2 studies about this thing and I don't trust those studies. So I'll give you an answer, but please bear in mind my answer is not reliable. LLM just don't do that. If there's one point in its training data, or if there's no point in its training data, it will just look for the nearest vector and be like, oh yeah, that's something similar, bang, off it goes, right? And I don't know whether, again, because it's a black box and we can't hook into the reasoning process and produce those sort of confidence scores, you can get it to spit out confidence scores, but they're not useful in this context. It won't tell you, oh, the knowledge doesn't exist or it doesn't know enough about this. So the AI companies have hired some of the best minds of today. So maybe that's a problem they may be able to solve in time. But currently, that's what I'm concerned about, especially with people that have built a business on AI or have relied on it for a long time. You may be asking it about one topic for a month straight and it'll produce you reliable answers. And then all of a sudden it'll produce something that's completely wrong. But I don't know if you would be able to catch that. I almost didn't.
That's, honestly, this is one of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had. I don't know if you have a question, Joey, but I had a caveat I wanted to issue because I feel like someone will misinterpret the black box that is my mind in the form of a question. I was not advocating for any sort of conflict between different types of theistic worldviews. What I was pointing to in the story in Battlestar Galactica, which I think is really interesting because it gets to the question of alignment, is what you find out in the story is that a fringe religious group had begun basically preaching to AI, taking it as a religious obligation that, we're supposed to convert people and they're basically people, so we should convert them to in that context, monotheism was a fringe belief. And the reason I say that is throughout the story, it's unclear. Does the AI actually believe in this? Has it reached a level of consciousness where it needs a motivation for its actions, right? It needs justification, right? Like humans do, right? Like it's no longer just, I'm hungry, therefore I took that food. I have to come up with some sort of elaborate explanation. Is it a form of psychological warfare? Like nobody really knows. And that ambiguity remains throughout the story. And I guess what I'm finding fascinating about this conversation is that we are being asked as people to live with not just a tremendous amount of ambiguity, but this is, to your point, this is not a horse that encounters an obstacle, right? If anything, I fear that we are becoming the horse, right? We're the means to the end. And so how do we navigate that moment? And that's why I found this conversation so incredibly helpful.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, it's interesting to me, Mohammed, that you end with the need for what I would say is epistemological humility, right? That AI may not be capable of that, but we certainly are as we're engaging with it.
I think we have that ability to be humble, right? We don't turn it on that often, but we can self-reflect and say, oh, you know what? I actually don't know this. And yeah, AIs are not yet there. And I think that's my concern, is that as they become more and more capable, and I think, again, they already are in terms of being able to access anything that's plugged in online, right? It's just the case of if you were willing to give it your bank account details, if you were willing to give it access to your stock trading portfolio, there are systems. Currently the mainstream systems today, if you pay the pro $200 a month fee, will log in and use those tools for you, right? That access is available now. The question is, if you give it a very broad objective, I don't think we necessarily have a way of then controlling where it stops.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to.